we are talking now to Gary Penn, who is a veteran in the video game industry, and he is known for having started way back in the 80s, writing as a British game reviewer for Zzap 64, and then he was also editor of The One from 88 to 90, and then a creative director at DMA Design, who was also responsible for GTA, which we
That's
all
true.
know and love.
That's true. I also was consulting editor at
Yeah.
Future Publishing for a while, so I helped launch a few titles with them and wrote for pretty much everything they did, I think.
Freelance producer from Konami. You worked on the Batman license game, and
I worked on a few. I worked on the
yeah,
main game I was looking after was Frontier, David Braben's Frontier. Uh,
and you won a Games Media Legend Award in 2007.
I
Oh my
did,
god!
yes.
Oh my god!
That's right. It's a big piece of plastic. It makes a very nice table mat.
Yeah, well, this is just a bit of what I found on the internet about you, and of course what I knew before I interviewed you last year about Autonauts, right?
Yes, yes.
So, well, let's start right at the beginning. How did you get in touch with computers, and how did it all start?
Ooh. I think it would have been way back in the early 70s, because we used to go to a place called Clacton in Essex, and we used to have we couldn't really afford a proper holiday, so we'd go one day there and back. And they used to have lots of piers, and on the piers they would have lots of sort of mechanical machines and sort of coin shover machines, those sorts of things. And then over the years, they started to add these other types of machines. So I think the first one I remember seeing was the sort of mechanical shark attack machine. That was the first sort of video game. Well, it wasn't really a video game. First sort of arcade game I remember seeing. And then I think one year Pong can't have been out that long in the arcades, and my parents used to give us sort of a small amount of money to go and spend in the arcades, which we would normally spend on those coin pusher machines. But this time, yeah, they had Pong, and I think I blew my money very quickly and had nothing left. Because I think I was playing with my sister. But yeah, it's so that would be my first ever encounter, I guess, with electronic gaming. But then after over the years, it would be things like those little old-fashioned black and white. They used to be called TV games, and they would usually only have um, one game, which would be Pong, but some of them might have other variants as well, like Practice, which was Pong with a wall instead of an opposing bat. And that was back when TVs were black and white, and I don't think we even had a remote control. It was the remote control was one of us who would get up and go and change the channels. Um, and then friends at school, their parents had access to computers, so I think some of them were teachers, and they had like a pet. There was another friend whose dad worked at Wang, and they had an old, I think it was an apricot. Um, and then, of course, you had things like the ZX80. So I was kind of obsessed with with this emergence of technology, primarily for gaming. But I used to program back then on in a few different languages, and I was kind of interested in all the tech. So you would go down to there's a British shop called WH Smith's, and they would have all these computer magazines on the shelves, and you'd be sort of scouring through all of those without buying any. But that was quite easy to do because nothing had games back then. It was all about sort of more pure computing, and a lot of computers back then were built from scratch. So you would be able to read through their game section, which was usually one or two pages, and usually written by quite serious journalists, fairly quickly. So this would have been, sort of moving through the 70s into the early 80s, I think.
Wow. I wonder how was the perspective from your family side? I mean, I've spoken to so many people about their history, and I was told many times that in the 70s, people were against computers. They were afraid that the computers taking teachers away, office jobs,
Yeah, I
and
don't know how much that was a
replacing
sort of.
workers.
Yeah, I don't know how much of that was sort of um, a media story rather than a reality. Because my parents were, I guess, less in. Both parents are working class, so they were. One was a mother was a cleaner. Actually, I think she still does clean. Father was a builder, and so everything was kind of um, very physical and mechanical. So the idea of technology coming along, because I mean, video recorders were still fairly new back then. My God, video recorders.
Yeah, VCRs.
Tape recorders and
I remember my grandparents having a Nordmende, which was a typical German one. It
uh,
was you had to physical press clunky buttons down,
yeah,
and
yeah,
it
yeah.
had a cable remote control.
That's right. Very mechanical things. And I think
Yeah,
it was a long time before we got
yeah.
our first video recorder. But I mean, the first computer I had was what was the first one I had was VIC-20. So my friends had things like ZX81s and then Spectrums. A few of them had some of the more obscure ones, like actually a few friends had BBCs. Few of the posher friends, and what was the other one? There was the one that had fourth. There were a few different types. There was the Ace. There were different, so most of them ran basic, fairly standard basic,
Yeah.
and some of them sort of ran slightly twisted versions of basic using weird keys, like on the ZX81 on the Spectrum. And there were a few that ran fourth, and what was the other language? Can't remember. But I was more of a I was into sound. I liked audio. I liked good audio, and the ZX81 didn't have any sound. I don't think the Spectrum had a really weedy little sound chip at the time. Although people end up doing some great stuff with that.
Yeah,
So
it's
I went the
interesting.
Commodore route.
It's interesting that what people obviously didn't know back then is that you could do so much more with the machines, but you had to figure it out yourself. I mean,
Yeah,
you mentioned the sound capabilities of the ZX Spectrum.
yeah,
Actually, for example, when later games were transformed, like Power Drift, which was an arcade machine, a racer, and it came to the Z64, and Dave Lowe actually composed the conversion of the music for it, and he fairly made a very good version on the ZX Spectrum,
yeah.
but that was along the last years of the
That's right.
machines.
Yeah, yeah. People start realizing what you can do with it. Well, even now, I mean, I have friends who do lots of demo code, and the stuff they do with spectrums and so on is quite astonishing. I think it's just people start to understand there are different ways of doing things that, you know what, we should just try the impossible. Because it reminds me of when you first hear sampled sound being emitted from a. Actually, I don't remember sampled sound on VIC-20, but certainly on C64.
Yeah.
And I remember there was the Kung Fu Fighting sample did the rounds, and I think that consumed the entire RAM of the C64. But and you'd be playing it over and over because it's just amazing that this sample, this amazing quality sound, which was, I don't know, 2-bit,
Wow.
was coming from this C64.
Yeah.
But I started
Well,
with VIC-20, which had no RAM. Um,
yeah.
it had a proper version of BASIC, which I liked, proper keyboard, which was also important.
Which is
So
interesting
I
because most people had a Spectrum, and you said they had a Big 20 first instead.
mm, I did. Had to save up. I'd end up taking on loads of different part-time jobs and saving up and sort of cashing in, merging birthday and Christmas presents to eventually afford this VIC-20, which I think I bought from a Commodore show. I can't remember now.
Wow.
And that was I don't think. In fact, I couldn't even afford the tape deck at first, so I couldn't store anything.
Uh,
So I was anything I wrote or programmed. So I couldn't load any games. Oh no, actually that's not true. I think I had one cartridge. I think I had a copy of Jelly Monsters before that got banned.
nice.
Yeah, but I think that was about it. And then eventually saved up enough to get the tape player, so I could actually load things into and also save the programs I'd written as well. But that had some fantastic. I mean, it's quite a chunky thing, but the audio on it was superb, and the sound chip on it was just fantastic. So that for me was an important thing. And then obviously migrated from that to C64. I think as when everyone else was moving towards Spectrums, I went for C64, which had a bit
Ye-
more RAM because the VIC only had 3.5K, which is
Yeah.
pathetic.
Yeah, I mean, the main problem with the ZX Spectrum was they had no separated chips for everything. So the CPU and the GPU would be the same thing. So you wouldn't have separated video capabilities. That means you had a color clash, and actually the colors would run into each
That's right.
other, and like, oh my God.
Yeah, people figured out some elaborate ways around that. But the funny thing is, I was into. I mean, I had no particular technological bias or brand bias as far as I'm concerned. You know, all the computers were awesome in different ways because I was just such a junkie for anything that was technology and particularly computer and video games. I would play anything on any format. I didn't care.
Mm.
And you're always trying to find new stuff all the time, and then you end up playing more and more and more and more before you realize it. You've got um, you reach this point of oversaturation where you're just constantly craving something that's very different.
So, well, as you mentioned, making the impossible possible, I remember the last commercial game for the original commercial market for the C64 was Lemmings in '94,
Oh,
which
really?
was a game everybody said was impossible to do on the machine.
Yeah. The tricky bit is it would be easier to do on the Spectrum because I think you could do the digging would be the bit. It's the manifestation of the manipulation. Sorry, of the world is the hard part to do on the C64 because you didn't have any means of doing that very conveniently.
Yeah.
I think it was the screen was handled differently on the VIC-20 as it was on the C64. My memory's gone really hazy on all this stuff, but I know the Spectrum. I think it's because you could read and write to and from the screen um, directly, whereas you couldn't do it on the 64 because it had to go through a different means of doing it. So it was a character-based system on the 64.
Yeah, exactly. So, when was that time you started writing for SAP 64? Was there some steps in between that isn't known?
It was well, I was playing lots of games, and then there weren't very many, as I said before, there weren't very many, well, there weren't any real games magazines. There was computer and video games, which I wasn't really that fussed about. And what else was there? Oh, computer listings. You see, that's the other thing. You would learn programming by using other people's listings, and you end up having to debug them yourself because they wouldn't work. And also, it was a cheap way of getting games. Most of them were terrible, but occasionally there were some really good versions of games coming out. There was some
Hangman.
fantastic. We had yeah, a lot of them were like that. We had at school we had a CPM machine, and we used to write some software and games for that. But there was a listing I remember in one of the magazines for CPM, and we were like, "What?" And there was a version of Missile Command. It was actually a really good version of Missile Command as well.
Wow.
Yeah, so we ended up typing this thing in our school machine, and of course having to fix it because the listings rarely worked for all sorts of reasons. Um, yeah, played lots of games, and then read any magazine I could find. I think Personal Computer Games, which was the one that Chris Anderson launched for, can't remember the publisher now. VNU. They that was a sort of proper games magazine. I really enjoyed that. It had some really nice approach towards games and really enthusiastic about it. It felt like it was written by people who cared about the games, whereas I'd say most, if not all, magazines back then, they felt like they were written by professionals and grown-ups who didn't really care quite so much. So yeah, I was into that magazine, and they used to run this competition score, a bit like the score lord that we did in Zzap. They used to run this thing where you'd send in your high scores, and I'd be submitting a few of those because I thought I was doing quite well in some games more than others. And then the one game I finished really quickly because I was obsessed with it was Encipital, Jeff Minter's Encipital. Um, and so yeah, I mailed. I think I wrote to him saying, "I finished your game," because I was a bit of a fanboy back then. And I think he replied saying, "Yeah, I think you must be the first. We've not aware of anyone else." And sent that score into PCG, Personal Computer Games, and then as it turned out, they were doing a competition to find Britain's best gamer, and the way they were deciding that was based on the letters and scores they received. And I got picked as one of the contestants for that. So I think there were five of us in the end for the final. Julian Rignall was one of the others, and yeah, went to London um, which was quite a big deal for me going to London. I was like, whoa, going to London. So didn't get to the big city very often because I grew up in a fairly small town. And yeah, we entered this competition. I think I came third, maybe. I think Julian was second. Yeah, maybe third. Julian was second, and it was can't remember the other guy's name. He came first. And then it turned out when VNU, the publisher of personal computer games, decided to shut that down. I think they were just trying to cut costs. Chris Anderson was out of a job, and I think he hooked up with Newsfield, who were talking about launching something. And so the next thing I know, I get this call out of nowhere saying, "Are you interested in a job?" I was like, "Yeah." So I was I think I was 18 at the time. I think I'd failed my A levels, and I was just trying to figure out what to do with myself. And yeah, get this call out of nowhere from Chris asking if I wanted a job. Went for a sort of informal interview in London where we just met up in a pub, I think it was, and had a chat. And the next thing you know, he's asking me to write a review test to see if I was up to it. I can't think what it was. I wrote it for Summer Games, I think it was, or Summer Games 2, was it? Might have been Summer Games 1.
Wow, the
Um,
old Epics classic.
yeah, they were amazing at the time. And yeah, so I wrote a review for that. It was good enough to please him, and he took us on. So the next thing you know, I'm moving down to this equally small town called Yeovil in Somerset, which is where Chris was working and setting up Zzap, and that's how we started. So that would have been sort of end of '84, beginning of '85, I think.
Wow. So you had this job everybody dreamed of, being paid for playing computer games.
Yeah, we used to get a lot of people saying, "Oh my God, you're joking! You get paid to play video games." Yeah, you don't understand. It's actually a shitload of work. It's not as simple as just playing the game. And we're also quite obsessive about trying to finish them as well. So we really cared about trying to make sure we finished as many of the games as possible to give them a fair. But of course, it's impractical because you're dealing with so many.
Mm. I
Um,
wonder, did you get poke lists to type into from the manufacturers,
no,
from the
they
developer studios?
no, they weren't really a thing back then. I mean, I knew friends who there were friends of mine who would do that kind of thing, but not. It wasn't really a thing. People didn't really tend to sort of hack the games. I mean, it was going on, but it wasn't as there wasn't the convenience that you have now, say with the internet, where you can connect with people instantly.
Ah,
You're talking about these bubbles, these pockets of isolation where people are doing their own thing in isolation. No one's aware that they're doing these things, and you sort of get these connections occurring through word of mouth. So any hackers that were hacking things in any way, shape, or form wouldn't necessarily know the existence of any others, apart from things like some of the shows that were back at the public shows back then. So there was like a Commodore show, which was obviously exclusively Commodore related stuff. I think there was another couple of them. I cannot remember for the life of me what they were. But yeah, so people would meet up there, so you meet other fans and other like-minded people. But that's it's like some sort of super slow motion internet. Because
wow.
people take forever to sort of hook up, and even then,
Yeah.
even when they're hooked up, it's like, how do they keep in contact? It's not like, although modems were a thing still back there because we had CompuNet. There were a few modem-based services back then, so we used CompuNet on the C64 for communication, and there were MUDs as well. So people had modems. It's just they weren't very commonplace, and there weren't really any server-side cloud-based systems to sort of collate all this.
Yeah, but I was more going the direction. I mean, many games. I mean, in the later magazines, you could find poke lists where you could type in pokes to get unlimited lives and so on.
That's right.
And
Yeah. So
and,
they
and some games even had hidden key combinations so you could activate a
oh yeah
trainer.
they were great. But
So so
again,
I thought so I
oh,
thought maybe the publishers gave you those
no,
info to
not
complete the games.
no, very rarely. And we certainly at the beginning we tried not to use cheats if we could possibly help it as well.
Okay.
So a lot of it was just trying to do it the hard way. And there's a
Gosh.
few of you playing, so in theory you can sort of spread the load a bit by making sure that. So the idea that Chris Anderson had with Zzap was this. That's a really nice idea where to sort of he had this obsession, I think, with um, objectivity with reviews. So that sort of occurred later on when he did Ace, and Ace had this whole marking system out of 1,000, which was crazy.
Wow.
But when we did Zzap, he had this whole idea of not just doing like a five, a review out of 5 stars or out of 10, but he wanted to have a more in-depth breakdown. I think he did a similar thing on PCG, where you sort of break it down into categories of quality, and they're reviewed out of percentages rather than smaller numbers, so you can have that granularity, so that you can be more precise. So there's a whole sort of sense of it being a much more scientific process. But of course, the reality is when you're trying to review so many games, because we used to have these, you'd end up having sort of a key reviewer who would play the game as much as possible, and then would provide 2 comments, but we wouldn't obviously have enough time to play it as much as the lead reviewer. But that would provide a degree of sort of balanced objectivity with 3 people, and of course, 3 people, in theory, you should be able to get some sort of meaningful outcome, rather than it being a deadlock with 2 people. And then afterwards, you'd have to sit down between the 3 of us, actually, and Chris as well. We'd sit down and we'd run through all of the games, and compare all our marks and discuss them. And it was a really long-winded process. I mean, it was very sort of honourable process, but it was utterly impractical from a magazine point of view. So you've got so many games to go through,
Wow.
all 3 of you, and all 3 of you having to discuss the games and sort of and discuss why you just think it deserves this mark. So that process got streamlined over the years, as it had to, because otherwise you just couldn't keep that up.
And nowadays you have respawn and autosave.
Mm. Quite well, yeah. There were those. That's the scary thing about it. You'd have games that would, before even because turbo loaders were still really rare back then. So you'd be dealing with games that could take like 20 minutes to load, which is crazy. And then even actually some of them took half an hour. But this game could take 20 minutes to load, and then it would get right to the end, and there'd be some data error, and there was no error checking at all, and it would just break, and that was it. Ha ha, tough luck. Your game didn't work. Or the game could crash. If the game crashed while you're playing, it's like, oh, I've got to load this up for 20 minutes again.
Yeah.
So, and yeah, no saves. Saves were pretty rare.
Gosh.
There were no maps. The amount of things you forget that you take for granted now that are just, of course, why wouldn't it have these things? Why wouldn't it have some auto save? Why wouldn't it have a cloud save? Why wouldn't it have built-in maps? Why wouldn't it? Why I could just check out a YouTube video to find out how to sort this out. No, none of that was there. It was all sort of long-winded, slow motion. It's an interesting point of history where you're effectively going from this sort of physical media,
Yeah.
like board games and role playing games and so on that I used to play, to this electronic versions, and suddenly there's an interesting sort of hybrid where the games are still quite clunky and physical in their way, but they are very much electronic. And those degrees of convenience where the games are purely electronic now. There are none of these um, failings or physical limitations that we had back then. So
I
yeah,
have a
you'd make
story
your own.
about that, by the way,
What's
I
that?
would like to share.
Mm,
And once, I think it was 10 years ago, I got a regional copy of Summer Olympiad 88, and
uh-huh.
it was like, wow, nice. Now, I think it was from Tyrant Soft, and I was like, oh, nice. Finally, I have something I can play with my friends on a
Uh-huh.
real diskette. Perfect. And then I saw like on the internet on the Commodore Scene database, like, wow, there are 101% cracks. I was like, what? Why would there be 101%? What is happening over 100?
Uh-huh.
Better than the original? How is that possible for an events game? There cannot be any trainers or something. And then I
Yeah.
figured that all copies of the game had one bug, and that is there is a bug in the code. If you enter more than one player, instead of going to the first event and loading it, it simply restarts the program, and you are starting at the title screen again. So
Nice.
so back in the days, you sometimes had games that were so bugged you couldn't play them
Yeah.
because the bug was in the master copy of the
Yeah.
tape
Yeah.
or the disc.
That's right. There were no patches.
Gosh.
Yeah. It's amazing though how things have come along so quickly as well. The technologies really hit this because back then there was this whole idea of having to squeeze games into tiny spaces and do these impossible things. They're much less of an issue now, which is great. So you're no longer, in quotes, pushing the hardware or breaking the limits of the hardware. You're fitting these things within the hardware, and you've got loads of middleware, which makes these things a lot more convenient to do, which is the way it should be. I mean,
Yeah.
you don't want that degree of low level, but equally, when you start losing some of that low level connectedness to the machines, to the machines and the software, in the same way that you maybe an author is writing their book, for example, they've got a very direct connection between the words they're writing and the story they're telling. Code can be like that as well. When you're writing code, you've got that degrees of personality can come through in the way that the code's written and the way you express through the code. But of course, some of that's lost when you start using middleware, and there's different sort of characteristics come through in a very different way, I think.
Wow. And also what I found out later is there are even some games that were released in different versions. For example, in France, the Cauldron was released in a version on diskettes, with Cauldron 2 as a compilation,
Oh,
and
really?
the game was made easier. So
Ah,
when you fly with your witch in the sky, you
yeah.
don't lose so much energy by the means of flying.
That would suggest they must have had time to make those changes,
Yeah, and
and
they
also
did.
get the feedback from it as well, and make the changes and remaster it for a
Yeah.
new audience. Yeah,
So
I
if you
suspect that
wanted
didn't happen very often.
yeah, so if you wanted a game fixed, or if you wanted, you know, the newer version, you had to buy the new game a second time.
Yeah,
It's like that nowadays it would be crazy.
yeah.
Like, "Ah, there's a new version of the game, you have to buy it again."
There's also that rush to get them out as well. So they didn't have entire teams of. Well, actually, I don't know that much about the evolution of the industry in the US or in
Uh-huh.
many other countries. So mostly UK and Europe, I
Sure.
understand. And that was mainly single people. We had this perception that the US had teams of people, whereas in the UK and Europe, it was more a case of it was one or two people if you're lucky, and usually everybody did everything, and they tested everything. They did all the graphics themselves, all the sound themselves, etc. And occasionally other people got involved, and you started to see this pattern emerge where two people would suddenly make a game, and there'd be a guy doing. Oh, there's an artist who's doing all the art. Whoa,
Wow.
luxury! Rather than one person having to generate it all themselves. And then yeah, audio comes along, and we get people like Rob and
Wow.
Martin and dozens of others emerging, doing all their own bespoke music for games. And like,
There's a
whoa.
phrase for that, bedroom labels, right?
Yes, that's right. The old bedroom. Yes, that's right. Because a lot of that's certainly how I started as well. You'd have kids stuck in their bedroom. Although I was downstairs because we only had one telly in the house, so I had to be in the sitting room and had to book time. So if anyone else wanted to use the TV, I got kicked off.
Gosh, yeah. Interesting. Um, so what is the times at Zap 64 that you remember that were the best?
Um, Interesting question.
Yeah.
I don't know. I kind of forgotten a lot of it. Gary Liddon's very good at remembering a lot of what happened back then. I've got a terrible memory for this stuff, and I used to have a fantastically encyclopedic memory, but I think I rely too much on Google these days for everything. So Google is my memory. I don't tend to remember facts and data anymore. I just tend to
Uh-huh.
Google keywords and I get back what I need.
But
Um,
but but there must be some experience you had that was so dear to your heart that you still remember it. Personal memory.
I'm sure there were many, but the fact that I don't remember them doesn't necessarily make them any less precious. It's just
Okay.
I'm trying to think. I mean, it was the fun thing about Zap back then was we were the Newsfield as a company was quite unique in the way it was doing things. No one else was doing magazines like we were doing them, and I think Chris Anson would be the nearest to that when he started Future Publishing. That was about the nearest competitor we ever had, although they didn't directly compete with us because they didn't do a Spectrum magazine and they didn't do a Commodore magazine. But the atmosphere generally was it was a bit like a mixture of family and school, I guess. It was like, we worked all the time. I don't think I ever took any time off at all.
Wow.
For the first 3 years, all we did was just work and drink and a few other things, but mostly work. So the general atmosphere used to be, yeah, I say family and school because it reminds me of those things in that you have the highs and the lows, and you have these arguments, and then you kind of forgive each other because there's a sort of degree of blood being thicker than water, that sort of mentality.
Wow.
Um, so yeah, hmm.
Well, I mean, you said once in an interview that working for a magazine helped you later as a game designer. So it must have some experiences that influenced you.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things would have influenced that. I was making games before I was on Zzap, so I think it's the making, the playing. I mean, principally doing something and also finishing something is the best way to learn anyway. Um, but yeah, playing. I think the process, the thing that helps on magazines is the process of completion and the fact that you don't have any leeway in completion. You have this physical product that needs to be completed, to a certain standard by a certain time, and you you can't run late because if you run late, the degree of dependency down the chain, which is less of an issue these days with electronic media, but with physical media, it was problematic. So you're trying to deliver this magazine once a month, and you can't run late. So you develop tricks and techniques and ways of structuring the
Wow.
process and getting these things done. And you just learn that quality is quality is almost a luxury, if that makes any sense. Where getting something done is more important than the quality of it. To a certain extent, there will always be exceptions to this. But at least you've got something you can judge. Whereas if it's not complete, you can't judge it
Mm.
in the same way. So getting that magazine out and trying to make it as good as it could possibly be, and then the other thing you learn from going through this process is the fact that you're doing this on a regular basis means you can improve each time. Whereas, of course, if you're spending, I don't know, I think the longest I've spent on any one game has been about 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
It's really hard to channel that back into an improved process because you've spent so long on one thing.
Mm.
Whereas, if you look at it in magazine terms, and we're talking sort of chalk and cheese in terms of magazines and games, but in terms of making things, delivering things, and learning from making things, you're doing 12 times as many every year. So you're looking at 60, 72 iterations of a process on a
Wow.
monthly magazine compared to one game taking 6 years. So
Wow.
what have you learned from doing that one game? Probably quite a lot, but in terms of being able to feed that back into improving the process, a lot less. So that's certainly one of the things I did learn from making magazines is the need to complete um, is paramount. Whereas
Wow.
it's very easy when you're making something to sort of say, oh yeah, but and you'd see this with games a lot where it'll be like, oh yeah, it's not quite finished. I need to make it better. I need to do this. I need to do that. Um, and you see it particularly with bigger projects where it's very easy to get sidelined and tempting to. I mean, I think it's less of an issue these days, particularly with um, a lot of companies doing evolutions of the same brand. So if you're making one Assassin's Creed, it's not that making another one is easy. It's a lot more straightforward than it would be doing it from scratch, and it makes sense to feed what you know back into what you're about to do. I think it's a very positive thing to do, and that's what.
Isn't that something that EA did recently with the Command and Conquer remaster?
Oh right, I've
Could,
not.
can't you say that? I mean, they made for years. They made Command and Conquer.
Mm,
Then they made it worse. Then they stopped doing it,
Yeah.
and then they decided, okay, we are doing a remaster. And now EA once won the shittiest company of the year award, and now they are the heroes again by all the retro community players.
Oh, really? It's
Yeah,
interesting because EA back in the early 80s, early mid 80s, they used to do some great stuff. They're always doing innovative, interesting stuff. I remember it was EA and Brodebund, two American companies. They were always doing some, fascinatingly interesting, different stuff. And that was
yeah,
a kind of mark of difference. And then something, I don't know what, I didn't really follow EA specifically as a company, but something happened at some point. They just got really boring and clinical, and yeah.
Microtransactions.
Oh God, yeah. But yeah, it's also worth bearing in mind a lot of that comes down to the people rather than the company per se. There'll always be people who believe in moving things in a certain direction, and they might misconstrue how they're going to do that, and their goals may not always be as pure, perhaps, as somebody who's kind of into the game, for example. So Command and Conquer is a great example of where it's very easy, given how important Dune 2 and CNC were
Yeah,
in popularizing that type of game. If you're a fan of that game, and I was, if people start messing with the formula too much,
yeah,
it does get a little bit awkward if you're on the other end of that because you can't change it too much. But equally, if you're a fan, you want some change,
yeah,
but not too much change. You basically want more of the same but different. And it's
yeah,
a really hard thing to achieve. And some people just do it too cynically. I think, or some companies are very cynical about the way they might repeat what they do, um, and also how they figure out how to make money. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a business.
sure,
So
sure.
if you're running a business, you will need to make some profit. But how you choose to make that profit and how you choose to reinvest that profit and who benefits, who shares in that profit, that's a very different matter entirely. There's lots of different ways of handling that. And it can have a massive impact on, if you're on the other end of it as a player, as a fan, it can have a massive impact on the thing you love, which is really sad when that happens. I've been on the receiving end of that many times where I've really got into something, be it I don't know, authors, book authors, game types, game brands, um, music. Get into this thing, and you realize, you know what? You can't really depend on any one person or company um, to to necessarily deliver with that degree of certainty and consistency. And a lot of the times, it's kind of lightning in a bottle. It's just luck that these things occurred when they did. The zeitgeist is the most important thing of all in that respect. Um, so I've got more interest. I've got less interest in authors over the years, and more interest in just stuff that gets made. It's generally a more interesting thing. So I don't have that sense of this one person or this one company is going to deliver the next. It won't the next game won't necessarily be as anywhere. There's no guarantee it'll be as good as the last one. If it is, bonus. I think if anyone ever delivers any one good, finishing something, if anyone can finish something, that's great. If you can finish something well, that's really quite special. And if you can finish something well and it sort of catches fire, I mean, if you do that once, that is super amazing and super rare. If you do that more than once, well, wow, you are you have something. But I can't think of anyone in the world who's ever been that consistent in terms of developing amazing stuff. Um,
True, true. There's one thing I found is that in October '88 you actually switched from Zap to the One as a magazine.
yeah, that's because I left. So yeah, things were. I was just as a person, I was having a bad time. Around 87, that would have been, I think. And also just didn't. I just wasn't sure what I was doing with myself, and Newsfield was changing. It was trying to expand, and they were trying out all these new things, and new people are coming along, new magazines are happening. There's so many professional and personal things happening all at once. Um, I kind of just had a bit of a meltdown and decided, you know what, I'm off. Fuck this. I've had enough. And I left. Uh, and then my friend Graham Kidd, um, he kind of tempted me back because he said, I'm keen to we want to launch this new magazine. which is the games machine. And these are the things we want to do with it. And it's not just going to be video games, it's going to be about technology and how it influences play and games. I was like, wow, that sounds great. That sounds like a progressive thing. I like the sound of that. But we had a bit of, because Newsfield was expanding, lots of different personalities, that the family effectively fell out with each other at that point. And so a few of us got kicked out. Um, and that's the point where I decided, right, I'm gonna do something radically different. I'm just gonna how did I end up going to London? I think when I was in London, I think I bumped into somebody and they put me in touch with EMAP. And I had a chat with Eugene Lacey, he was the editor of CMVG, I think. It may have been at a show, and that's how I got into EMAP, and that's how the one started. Because so prior to that, I was on Commodore User for a bit, because the idea being, well, this is Gary Penn from Zzap. If we can leverage that to make Commodore User much cooler and more interesting, which of course is impossible because Commodore User was always quite dull. But that went okay, and the people on it were good, but wasn't kind of my thing. And EMAP were keen to expand, so one of the first things I did was a fortnightly. Didn't ever go anywhere. It was a fortnightly version of CMVG. EMAP were looking at doing a fortnight magazine that came out every fortnight, and they decided we should probably do this with computer and video games. So I did what are called dummy issues for that. And I don't know how that worked out in the end, whether they tested badly or whether EMAP changed their mind or whatever. But having done that, it was clear to EMAP that I could do something else, I could do something more. So I had a lot of grand plans for a magazine that was a bit different. Games were starting to look a bit more visually interesting, and I think it was more a case of I had lots of pretensions to make a sort of stylish, weirdly Edge. I didn't have I had very little to do with Edge at the beginning, even when I was down at Future. So there's no connection there. But Edge sort of turned out more into the sort of thing I was trying to do with the One, which was something a bit classier, and a bit more interesting in terms of how it dealt with how video games were reviewed and so on. So it was things that were way out of my comfort zone. But we did a lot of great things with the One. That was in profit really quickly because we managed to get a really strong hardcore fan base. It used to do extremely well with advertising. It was a great team. It was a timely sort of magazine to release, and we used to try and do things a little bit differently with that. So things like the paper size was unusual. It was everyone else was dealing with A4 at that time, and I actually initially wanted to do the One as a smaller magazine, sort of more of an A5. I actually wanted to do an A5 landscape magazine.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, that was inspired by. Actually, that was inspired by old Marvel comics I used to read. They used to do these UK rehashes of a lot of the American Marvel strips, and they'd rebundle them up into like Hulk comic and Spider-Man comic. And they did one comic, and I cannot remember which one it was, but it was a Marvel comic, and they did that landscape, and I really liked it.
Wow.
Because it was such an interesting idea. And all they principally did was chop the strips in half and put them across a wider page width. It meant they probably filled, they had less content in a single magazine because they could spread it over wider pages and split it in half.
Right.
But the format was really interesting. So that was one of the initial ideas of the One. There were a lot of different things we were trying to do with that. So screenshots taking the foreground. And that was something we took out of Zzap, where we were trying to get nice pictures in Zzap. And we used to have to take actual photographs of the screen back then. So there were some screen capture software, but it always used to give these horrible flat results. Screenshots. This is what we learned at doing Zzap, was the screenshots always look so much more, I don't know, alive. And much more representative of how the game really felt, not necessarily how it looked. Whereas the sort of clinical screen grabs back then used to feel quite flat and clinical and soulless. Um, so yeah, we're trying to do it with the one. So we had to get trying to get the screens nice and large, decent sized screenshots. Try to use screenshots wherever possible. So instead of using um, promotional art or whatever, it was always trying to use game footage and game pictures and trying to get games on the cover, and which at the time was a very unusual thing to do because people used to have, like on Zzap, we used to have Ollie doing these fantastic pieces of artwork, which is one of the key reasons for the magazine's success. I just wanted to do something different, so we're trying all these different things. We we ended up doing a lot of types of editorial that weren't being done at the time and ended up being really influential. So we had this feature called Work in Progress, which was about how are games actually made and what goes into making games, but trying to do it in a way that made it easy to understand. And I think that was one of the first times, if not the first time, things like sprites sheets were shown, because we used to try to get some development pictures and show how these things worked. Why do they have sprite sheets? How do these sprites? How do you actually get that thing that you're controlling in the game? Does it actually get in the game? We did these fantastic sort of interviews. The first one was Rainbow Islands. It was a really interesting breakdown as to how GraphGold made Rainbow Islands and how Rainbow Islands worked and how GraphGold actually put these games together. So yeah, that was a massively influential thing, and it's hard to believe that it ever was, but there weren't those types of things around back then.
Yeah, and I read that the one actually was a magazine that covered the PC, which is probably a rare thing for 88.
Yeah, we're interested in covering that. Primarily, we lumped it under the 16-bit machines, so that would have been Amiga. Because I didn't want to do Amiga when I was on Zzap. Zzap for me was a pure 64 thing. I did not want to introduce anything else in there. Although we ended up doing sort of supplementary. I don't even know why we did this. We did a piece on the NES on Zzap, which I don't know why we did that. And we did a piece on the C16 as well, which I didn't like doing that either. I don't know why we did that. But
Yeah,
yeah, for me, Zzap 64 was meant to be purely 64, and it wasn't about Amiga. And Amiga was a new thing; it was a different thing. It needed a whole new approach. And I don't think Newsfield at the time was in a position to do much about that. So I thought Games Machine was going to help fill that void for me, but it didn't. Um, I think it could have done, but as I say, we all sort of fell out at Newsfield, so that didn't work out. Which is why I ended up at EMAP and did the one for I think 2.5 years, maybe. Can't remember how long that went for. 20 something issues. And then weirdly had exactly the same experience as I had at EMAP at Newsfield, which was professionally and personally, everything felt like it was just not going very well. So
ah.
I thought, "Fuck this, I'm off." So I did the same
Wow.
thing again and
Uh,
left. And that's how I ended up at Future Publishing instead.
and then you worked on Frontier Elite 2.
Yeah. So after that, so the way it worked at Future was they ultimately wanted to get me down there full time, but I wasn't really into the idea of moving. I think I'd just bought a flat as well in London by that point. And there was the great property crash of what was that, 88, 89. And I already couldn't really afford it. So at that point, I was in negative equity, and I decided, I need to sort out this flat first before I do anything else.
Uh,
So couldn't really afford to do it because even renting out was tricky because you couldn't cover your mortgage. But I really just wanted to hang around in London for a bit longer. I didn't want to move down to Bath, so I did it on a sort of freelance basis. So I was a consultant editor, and that meant I just advised on mainly new launches at first, but also the existing titles. What might be done with them to improve them, and I also did loads of writing for them as well on all sorts of. I think pretty much every games title they had, I wrote for. Um, and what happened there? I really liked working there, but I can't remember why I didn't. I ended up doing other things, so I wasn't doing just future publishing because that was taking up all of my time. Uh,
but it must have been quite a nice feeling for you working on Frontier Elite 2, considering Elite, the original, was such a massive hit?
Oh yeah, well that came about because I expanded what I was doing. I wasn't just doing magazines at that point. I started to do sort of design appraisals of games and um, instruction manuals for games and all sorts of stuff. I was doing advertising copy for games and marketing copy for games and press releases. I was doing all sorts of stuff. Um, and that led to doing being a freelance producer for Konami on so it was my friend Colin Fuge who used to work at Firebird and then Activision and then Konami. I think he was leaving and they needed someone to fill the gap and he said, well, why don't you give it a go? You've done
Wow.
magazines before, why not give it a go? I was like, all right, I'll give it a go. So yeah, I took on that job and I think the main title I had to look after was Frontier, as I said. But there were others along the way. Like I used to have to evaluate titles that came over from the US to see if they were suitable for release in Europe or the UK. And then there were a few other titles I was producer on at the same time. So yeah, one of them was Batman Returns, I think it was. I can't remember what the others were. There were another two titles, but the main two were those. And the main one was Frontier. That was with, David Braben. Dave Lowe was doing the music.
Wow.
There
The
was
the
Chris Sawyer doing the PC version. Chris Sawyer was amazing.
so
Um,
the creme de la creme back in the days.
yeah, and that it was a hard thing to do because you're trying to manage it remotely. And David had very particular ideas about what he wanted to do with it. Um, and so we had, there were some disagreements about how stuff should be done, but ultimately it was his game. So there's not much you can do
Huh.
to drive it, as it were. And also, you don't want to mess with the formula too much because it's David's game. He knows where he's
Yeah.
going with it.
Yeah.
And I think he was with Frontier. I think he bit off more than he could chew, and he was trying to
Yeah.
do too big a thing too soon with too few people. I think he was the only person. No, I'm sure there was someone else actually working on it, but there basically hardly anyone else working on it. So
I
that
mean, I
in
mean,
itself.
I mean, that's the same thing happening today. Like Star Citizen.
Oh yeah,
That's the same thing you hear all the time. Like, Chris Roberts is crazy. He's doing more than he can chew and stuff.
it's why the finishing's really important, as I said before, and it's why a lot of things like Minecraft. If you looked at Minecraft now and you had to write it from scratch, and there was no precedent, you'd go what? But that's worked really well because that's evolved organically. But it's evolved organically from what was effectively finished. It was finished enough in its early sort of alpha state that you could use it and you could play it and have fun with it. So that's finished enough. But that allowed it to evolve organically, and a lot of games have come a long way because of that. And you get early access these days as a more formal way of doing that. But yeah,
Well,
trying to finish that sort of scale of game from scratch. Whoa.
yeah, I learned on my way that there are two parties in the game industry from the actual publishing opinion point of view. There are one side of the industry where the people say Chris Roberts can't finish it, he will fail, and there's that one other part where people say like this will be amazing once it's done, you know.
Yeah, there've always
So
been games like that though. They've existed even back in the old days where the games never came out. And those the Imagine games like Bandersnatch and Cyclops being the two obvious examples, but there are many others along the way where this game's gonna be amazing when it gets finished, and it never gets finished because it's really hard to realize any anything that's in your head. Putting that into some tangible form, be it a story, a book, or some music, or especially a video game because that comprises so many different parts. It's
yeah.
it's hard. So it's where the finishing, as I mentioned before, is really important because without that a version that's finished that you can build on, you have nothing to. That's why prototypes are incredibly handy for that, because you need that tangible thing to try it because it doesn't matter how well it works in your head. Doesn't matter how well your design document describes it. They're still far removed from the reality of what you're going to end up playing. And there's loads of
True.
stuff over the years I've seen that firsthand, where you design things, and you know, you think this is going to be perfect, it'll be brilliant, it'll be awesome, and then you realise no one else understands what's going on, and it's actually really imbalanced and flawed, and you're not entirely sure how to fix it because it's just more complicated and convoluted than you ever realised. And sometimes that's because you built it too convoluted too soon. You should have actually built a simpler version that you could try and build on. And there's a lot more of that going on these days, where people are doing that. They are building smaller and building up and out, and it's a much better process because, as I say, it allows you to measure what you've got rather than, you know, is Starter Citizen any good? Who knows?
Mm.
Although there is something out there these days which there wasn't before. It's the
Yeah.
same with oh god, what's it called? I always forget what
Cybernoid?
it's called. No, the game that got Keanu Reeves on in the end. And you know, whether no one's entirely sure whether that's going to come out or whether that's going to be any good. I keep forgetting what it's called. I'm sorry. It's not a game that interests me, so I forget what it's called.
So now you are Googling it.
Yes, I mean Cyberpunk.
Cyberpunk.
2077. Is
Yeah,
that ever?
I said it wrong. I said it wrong, and that is what I meant. Cybernoid was another game with
Yeah.
music from Year and Tell. That yeah,
Yes,
Cyberpunk. Cyberpunk 2077, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But that is coming out. It's supposed to coming out in November this year, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, exactly. It's still supposed to be coming out, and it's, you know, there have been games like this over the years where no, it's definitely coming. It's definitely coming.
And then you know then there was Black Lives Matter, and they said like, yeah, and Corona, so there's another reason to delay it.
Yeah, and you see that with governments as well, using all these things as excuses, and you're not entirely sure how valid an excuse or a reason it really is.
No idea.
No, I've got no idea. And it's one of these things where, from the point of view of the players, you believe in it. You want to believe in it because you want it to be that good.
Yeah.
And I'm the same with anything I get into, and you end up being the same as a journalist. Even back on Zzap when we were quite cynical, you still want stuff to work. You still want it to be really, really good. And sometimes when games would come out and they weren't anywhere near as good as you expected it to be, or you wanted it to be, or you thought it was going to be, or you were led to believe it was going to be, you'd be even more aggressive in the review because it's like, how dare you disappoint me? How dare you be bad? You're supposed to be brilliant.
like Final Fight for the Commodore 64, so bad.
Oh, I never played that. Oh, I can believe it.
or Hard Driving. I remember Dave Lowe said when he got the game to make the music for, he thought this will be a commercial disaster. And he was right, but he had to do the music anyway, you know?
Yeah. Well,
so
some of these things
sometimes
just don't work. I mean, how on earth you do 3D on a C64? It's really hard.
well it worked in Stunt Kart Racer.
That's true. That was written ground up specifically by Smart.
But the Hard Driving was more like a Spectrum conversion, which
Yeah. Well, it's also the other thing. You don't, as a journalist or as a player, you don't know what's going on the other end of it. And the poor person who had to put together that conversion might have had, like, you know, 2 weeks to do it under all sorts of horrible circumstances, but of course you don't care because, and I know when as a player and as a journalist, you just don't care. I don't care that you're struggling. I don't care you've got problems. Where's my game? Where's my really good game? I want my really good game now.
Yeah, well, the thing is, those games back in the 80s and 90s, they sometimes sold anyway because of the name of the composer who did the music for it.
Yeah. Well, that
Like,
was something we were pivoted to learn at Zzap, because all of us shared that same sort of interest in, you know, how are games made, and who makes them, and who are them. Because a lot of at the time, a lot of this wasn't a thing that people talked about. They didn't really talk to developers about how they made their games, and you know, it was more about the publishers and the games than it was the people who made them. So that's something that, certainly at Newsfield, we really pushed that forwards, and with Zzap, obviously, we pushed that forwards with Rob, and Martin in particular, but also other composers and developers to go with that, and that made a huge difference. And
David Crane, for example.
Yeah.
Everybody knew his name, thanks to Ghostbusters. which even wasn't supposed to be a Ghostbusters game, but was another game, and he just got the license and not enough time to make a
Yeah,
ground up game. So
and
like,
that's a
wow,
classic example of how that can work. Yeah, but it shows where they're trying to desperately get something out and get something done, and there is a way of doing it. How do we get this done? How do we get this done? And the only way they can figure out how to do it is let's just reskin this thing.
and just to mention it, because he said the publishers a couple of times, the most interesting thing about Frontier Elite 2 is the publisher, which was GamesTech, who published things like Wheel of Fortune and
Well,
stuff.
yeah, that was an utter fucking shambles because what happened with that was Konami decided to get rid of some of their catalog, which included Frontier and GamesTech. GameTech bought it. Now, GameTech, when they bought it, they didn't take me on at all. They just kicked me off. It was like, oh, we don't need you. That's fine. No, we're fine. We don't need you. Which was a really dumb thing to do because they effectively ended up kicking off the producer who um, who knew most of what was going on. They didn't even talk to me about what was going on with it. They just bought the game and pretty much put it out not long afterwards. So that was entirely them making a really bad decision. I think was
Ah, yeah.
they didn't let the game get finished. They didn't let the people who were involved in it. So it was just like, right, David, do enough to get it done, and we'll ship it. And they just shipped it, and it was like, what a fucking mess that was. Yeah, I don't know what they were playing. I think, as you say, they were producing all these sorts of games like Wheel of Fortune and so on, and they just had a very, I don't know, commercial perspective, and decided to sort of apply that to Frontier, which is like the last game you want to apply that kind of mentality to. Well, it needs to get finished and it needs to come out. I don't deny it, but yeah, the way that came out was an utter shambles. So yeah, no, most people don't remember Frontier very fondly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, people start to remembering it because Dave Lowe is always mentioning it in interviews. It's like,
Yeah, he was.
yeah, there was this other elite nobody talks about.
Yeah. He was I forgot about Dave Lowe. Yeah, he did just some cracking music for that as well.
Yeah, yeah. So you see, you remember a lot. I just have to throw pieces to you.
But yeah, I mean, that's usually the story. It's making those neural connections that will allow our bits to unfold. But it's how well I remember it. I couldn't tell you because there's so many. It's been a fairly busy life, so I don't tend to cling on to things that much. So I tend to move
Yeah,
move forward. So that's one of the reasons I don't tend to remember many of these things.
yeah. Which makes me more surprised that last year you said like, yeah, we can talk about the old stuff.
Oh God, yeah. Oh yeah, I'm happy to talk about anything. It's just whether I remember it or not.
Yeah. And then in what I read, there was a gap between 93 and 97, and the next step would be Grand Theft Auto. But I believe there must be something happening in the 4 years between, no?
And, yeah, so up to 95, I was still doing, as I mentioned before, sort of freelancey things. So I was doing magazine work still. I was still reviewing stuff, I think. I was still writing articles, but I was also still doing loads of stuff for publishers. So, I was reviewing games for them internally as a quality test. Um, I think I was doing some game design as well. I was writing press releases and marketing materials and yeah, instruction manuals, all sorts of stuff, but quite a spread of writing. Mainly because the instruction manuals were good, sort of sensible, stable money to keep alive. So that's pretty much what I did up to 95, and then a friend of mine, BMG Interactive, had started up. I think they'd started up end of '94, maybe. It might have been early '95. But a couple of friends had started there, and they were looking for a senior producer. But they're also looking for somebody because I'd worked with them on different companies like Sega and Virgin, and yeah, they wanted somebody who could be more of a producer, which I'd done, but B also provide materials where possible. So yeah, I became senior producer at BMG Interactive in 1995, I think that was, and that's the direct connection to DMA started there. So that was as a producer, I had two teams I was looking after, which were DMA Design and a company called um, oh, NMS. They were up in Walsall, where Elite Systems used to be. So they were doing 3 games. NMS were doing 3 games. They were doing a pool game, a tank game, and what's the third game going to be? It sort of ended up becoming a sort of thrust style game. And then DMA were doing, they'd signed up 4 games. So everyone was after, this was in the mid 90s when, lots of big money came into the industry again, because that had occurred in the 80s as well before, where companies like Ariola Soft, which was a Bertelsmann related thing.
Which was a German publisher,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. They were
yeah,
Bertelsmann were huge. They got bought by Sony, but they were an enormous company. They were founded by a guy selling books. It was a sort of mobile library. That's how that started. But
nice.
yeah, so we had like companies like CBS, and this happened again with the when the VCS and that initial console boom. You get big companies like Warner and CBS, all these companies coming out of the woodwork and trying to throw their big money at it, thinking they can make a success out of it. And of course, it's not that straightforward. And the same thing happened again in the 80s. Same thing happened again in the mid 90s. So Bertelsmann were caught up in this. There were lots of bidding going on for any product you could get, any developers you could get. And of course, everything was shifting to 3D, and PlayStation was a thing, and N64 was a thing, and Saturn was a thing. And yeah,
But we should mention DMA Design was also the studio that did Lemmings.
That's right.
Yeah, to make the connection between the modern world and the past, because right now DMA Design is has been rebranded in '02 as Rockstar North.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. So they also did some C64 stuff as well, I think. DMA, I'm sure they did. No, it's not. It was mainly Amiga stuff. My bad. Yeah, so they also did Hard Guns.
Yeah,
And,
it's true. Lemmings was done by a different studio for the Commodore 64, by a Dutch development group.
right.
And they connected 2 Amigas together and said like, yeah, with this setup we can make Lemmings, the game that was told to be impossible.
Cool.
So I remember Psygnosis was the publisher, and I was told that for them, Lemmings was just another system to be covered with the Commodore 64. So for them, it wasn't such a big thing like
Yeah.
for the press.
I can remember seeing Lemmings before it was Lemmings. It was just a simple series of, because I was doing a big Psygnosis piece for the One, and went up to Liverpool to see what they were up to, and they had loads of stuff in development. And it was a lot of it was just sort of animation and visualization, and there were a couple of games. There was one called Gore, which was some fighting game that had loads of blood in it. I can't remember who was making that one. That was DMA or someone else. There was another one called it wasn't called Lemmings at the time, but it was basically little animation that ended up being Lemmings.
Okay.
I can't remember what the other games were, but there's some other games that they had sort of sprite animation for, and some backgrounds or whatever. So yeah, DMA. I was looking after DMA as senior producer at BMG. So that for me was they had 4 games, and the 4 games were across 4 platforms, so it was a big deal. And as I say, all the big companies back then were trying to bid. So I think BMG outbid Virgin in the end, and paid quite a lot. Well, it was quite a lot at the time. These days, it seems like peanuts by comparison. I think it was like £1 million per game, and each one of those games is across 4 platforms. So that would have been PC, PlayStation 1, N64, and Sega Saturn. And the 4 games would have been what was called Race and Chase back then, which became GTA, a game called Cranium, which became Tactics, a game called Space Station Silicon Valley, which stayed the same, and a game called Covert, which was a sort of Metal Gear Solid style game actually.
Okay.
And they were in different degrees of evolution because DMA at the time was growing really fast. They were taking on loads of people, but they didn't have the process in place to manage them, which I didn't realize until I ended up working there how bad that was.
Wow.
So they had an old school developer mentality, just getting on with it. But they failed to realize that that things had got bigger and harder, and you needed more teamwork, team management, etc.
Wow.
So those were the 4 games across those 4 platforms. And then what happened was, as we were talking to all the different platform vendors like Sony and Sega and Nintendo, Nintendo decided they wanted some degree of platform exclusivity with at least one of the titles. Otherwise, they wouldn't be interested in the other titles coming out on N64. So potentially, you could lose. All 4 versions could never come out on N64.
Wow.
Yeah, so one of them had to be a platform exclusive. So that was Space Station Silicon Valley because that felt. Can't remember why that got chosen, but that got chosen as the N64. So that meant, fairly early on, you've lost 3 of the 16 versions you're supposed to get. So there was obviously no Saturn version, no PlayStation version, and no
Wow.
PC version. Yeah, but it did mean it can come out on other formats. Um, but yeah, DMA was struggling with it. I mean, if you're building something like GTA, which didn't exist at that point, I was kind of hoping some of my experience on Frontier would have helped, because they're similar sorts of games in some respects in that they're the way they're structured. This free form, open world play with focused missions and so on. But at the same time, they're kind of poles apart. Um, so DMA was struggling to make all 4 games. As it turned
Wow.
out, when I eventually ended up at DMA, because it was hard to tell when you're a producer, it's not always easy to. You have milestones, and the milestones get increasingly more challenging to deliver. So design documents are generally a lot easier to deliver than a finished game. Um, and some of that's based on you want this to work, you want these games to be awesome because they sound like they're going to be awesome, and you kind of cut slack to a certain extent, but at the same time you still got these milestones to meet. Um, and it was quite a challenge to drive those forwards and get those made and done when you're sort of dealing remotely. So I had to spend more and more time up there. Um, but yeah, that was hard for everybody because you're dealing with 3 new platforms: the PlayStation, the Saturn, and the N64. You're dealing with 4 brand new games that have never existed before, and are not like anything else. Although there are some similarities to other games, but this is quite a complicated thing to do. You've got a company that's tiny and suddenly growing and taking on more people. All these things make for it's amazing any of these games ever came out because the odds are stacked against them.
Yeah.
Um, and then BMG. So I worked for the American arm of BMG. So we were in the UK, but we were employed by the US. So the UK division was a different branch entirely. So we worked with them, but not for them. So Sam Hauser, for example, he got taken on as I can't think what he was on BMG UK, but he sort of looked after signing up their games and just looking after those games getting made. He was one of the few people who worked for the UK division. There weren't many people on there. It was quite a um, small staff. Whereas I worked for the US version, so we had these weekly conference calls with our bosses in America, and pretty much every week, as GTA, as it was clear, DMA was struggling with these games. Um, it, it, it the American division decided, you know what, we need to do something about this, and GTA in particular, it was called GTA by that point. Was really struggling, and they did some focus testing on it, and it was just a mess, and it just didn't. Nobody, I was thinking I was one of the few people who still believed in it, but hardly anyone else believed in it. So they wanted to can it every week. They just wanted to pull the plug on it and let it die. So every week you're sort of arguing to try and keep it going because you believe there's something in there. But part of that's naivety, because part of that is based on the fact that, as a concept, this is going to be awesome. This is going to be a living, breathing city. Got these missions. You get to play cops and robbers. It's going to be awesome.
Wow.
But of course, the reality is you got to make the damn thing, and progress was both slow and not great. Um, yeah, and you've got to be careful about how you measure out the milestones, because on the one hand, you don't want to drive it into the ground by not paying any money for the milestones, but at the same time,
Uh,
you can't just give money away for not delivering the work. So there's a sort of degree of old school mentality going into that.
yeah.
And then
It's
eventually,
shocking for me to hear that the game almost never happened to be.
oh yeah, quite often. Yeah, that was. It's amazing to look back, but yeah, it almost never happened. But it did. Eventually, so I got the US office shut down. BMG US shut down in when was that? They started laying off staff, so they made everybody redundant in the UK, switched myself and a few others. So that would have been mid '96, maybe. It was towards the end of '96, maybe. Um,
So how did you solve this problem with the GTA, if I may ask? You said you didn't want to throw money away, but also you wanted to get the game finished. So how did
yeah, so you basically just liaise with the team. You sit down with the team, you talk to the team, the key people who are working on the game on the team, and try to figure out ways of how the hell are we going to make this work. And that kept changing often, and it didn't always work. So some things sort of made progress, but then you realise that the what appeared to be progress wasn't actually progress. It was sort of more superficial than it ought to be. Um, yeah, you're trying to help the teams get
Wow.
it done as best as you can by helping them with the planning, by helping them with what can be done, what needs to be done in what order, um, rather than it being all done all done at once, and to a not necessarily great standard. There were loads. There's some really bad stuff in the earlier games where, if I recall correctly, there was literally a button to open and close the doors on the cars, and weird things like that, where it got a little bit too realistic in its approach.
Wow.
Yeah.
So are you happy in the end that you are one of the reasons the game finally made it alive and now is being such
Well,
a big series?
I guess so. Yeah. I don't think with hindsight I had that much influence um, until I joined DMA. So yeah, managing it remotely was difficult. Um, then I left BMG, but because I got on well with Dave Jones, when I was going up there as producer, and I was sharing some of the game ideas I was working on at the time, he was quite interested in them because they were very different. And we got on well, so he offered me a job after I left BMG. Um, I think I took a little while to think about it, and then went. I think I went up. I think I started towards the end of '96, and then moved up to Scotland at the beginning of '97. And that's where, if I made any difference, it would have been around that point, because it was a case of we've got to get this done. BMG were really pushing hard to get the game finished. And I think by that point also lots of platforms had died. So the Sega Saturn, for example, um,
Short life.
that yeah, so that was three other versions that have been canned. So you can see they get chipped away. Suddenly you've gone from 16 versions. You lose three because N64 exclusivity. You lose three more because of Saturn's dead. And I think we lost. So Covert wasn't working out at all because there wasn't much of a team assigned to it, and the design wasn't that strong. So that had to shift to become. That actually changed into Wild Metal Country. Would you believe? Uh, the DMA was struggling as well financially at the time, so they'd been signing up other deals like with GT Interactive. So they signed up two games called Attack.
GT, wasn't that called Kremlins before?
No, GT Interactive was. I think it was another one of those big companies that tried to sort of bring lots of money into the game and buy their way in, as it were. I think they bought. I think they were publishing Sex and Drugs and Rock and Roll from Sensible as well.
GT became a part of Atari.
I can't remember. You might be right.
Yeah, just look it up in Wikipedia.
Yeah, they got bought up. I think they got bought up a couple of times.
Yeah.
The Gremlin, weirdly, because so when I eventually started DMA, it became clear that financially DMA was struggling as well because they were spending all this money and not getting anything finished. So the contracts, the original contracts, got extended to keep them going. And by that point, they were doing. It was they realized they couldn't do the PlayStation version of GTA. They just didn't have the staff. And it was basically you had to get so many people on GTA to get that finished. So there wasn't the experience or the numbers of people to get that done. So that ended up being subcontracted to Visual Sciences, who did the PlayStation version, which sold about 4 times as many copies as the PC one. So that was lucky that got done. And Tactics was the other one that don't think that ever came out on PlayStation. Only came out on PC. And yeah, Wild Metal Country that did come out on PC and Dreamcast, weirdly. Dreamcast conversion. I can't remember how that came about. I think there was some money flying around from Sega to have some exclusivity, and I think that's where it came from.
And how was it working as a freelancer for Konami?
Well, it wasn't particularly interesting, believe it or not. It was quite
Really?
matter of fact. Yeah, I mean, it was the UK division. Didn't have much to do with Japan at all at the time. I suspect it's a lot more integrated now than it was then. Yeah, it was quite a slow motion process. I mean, again, the internet wasn't really a thing. A lot of stuff was done by phone calls and letters, not emails and VoIP. Yeah, it wasn't especially memorable. I mean, the most memorable thing I'd say would be working on Frontier with Davids.
Nice. Of course, minus Game Tech. That wasn't a good experience, as you said.
No, that sucked.
Yeah, well, they worked on the wrong games before, you know.
Yeah. I can't remember what that. I think did not Take-Two buy up Game Tech. I can't remember.
Yeah, could be.
Yeah, these things tend to end up being quite incestuous. So yeah, so when I arrived at DMA, it was obviously there was not much money going around. We also needed to get some things finished, but we also had to get some things to hit milestones. So the GT Interactive games, they had to hit milestones, so we had to sort of fudge things to get those milestone paid, so keep going. And then Gremlin ended up stepping in and buying the company. I can't remember that was. It would have been April, May '97, I think. They bought DMA and sort of bailed them out, basically. So it gave us a bit more stability to get things done. But my priority was, so I went to it more like a magazine editor in that respect, trying to make sure that how the hell are we going to get these things finished, and trying to understand the state of the projects. So I was responsible for 7 projects at the time.
Wow.
And you have to trust the teams to a larger extent because they're the ones who are closest to the projects and need to understand how to get things done. But equally, it helps to have some sort of external perspective. It's very easy to get lost in the midst of it when you're doing it yourself. So yeah, that was my main objective, was to sort of provide a higher level strategy for all 7 games, but also a lower level, more tactical response to getting them finished. So the first one I picked was GTA because that was the one that was they'd gone through yet another redesign actually between the phase where I wasn't a producer and I wasn't at DMA. The team had basically consolidated and reworked what they had into something else. But it was the biggest problem they had was it still wasn't working properly. Game kept crashing,
Yeah.
so people couldn't make things, test things, etc., etc. So it couldn't move forwards. So yeah, first thing to target was stability, but the second thing to target was making sure that right, forget all these things because they're never going to get done in time. Let's just focus on getting what we can get done on time. I don't think it went down very well at first because you're talking to people who are really attached to what they've made. But you need the equivalent of a magazine editor to come in and say, we've got to get this done. We're going to have to not do some of these things, or we're going to have to do some of these things not as well as you want to do them. Otherwise, it's never going to come out. So I applied that sort of mentality across the board, but primarily initially with GTA. And I think that worked. It came out in the end. It wasn't dreadful. It's obviously important. Um, it's evolved into something massive, which is way after I mean, it's one of these things that who really made GTA? And then there were effectively two versions beforehand with 1 and 2. But Rockstar made GTA really. And the team that made Silicon Valley, or the core team of Silicon Valley, without them, actually, there's another interesting thing to see where you've got these effectively these planets aligning, where it's amazing a lot of these things worked out as well as they did at the time they did. And when you're on the inside of it, you don't realize how implausible it seems from the outside.
Yeah.
In the same way, it's impossible to believe that GTA was almost canned frequently.
Wow.
That's really hard to believe. When you're in the midst of it, it makes perfect sense that it's going to happen. But yeah, GTA 3 is the one that made GTA, and that was down to a lot of things aligning. That was down to DMA changing. Gremlin had sold DMA to Infogrames bought Gremlin, I think. That was it. Infogrames bought Gremlin, and then Infogrames sold DMA to, which wasn't Rockstar at the time. I think it was Take-Two then.
Yeah, I mean, if you look nowadays, there are not many game IPs back from the day that are still a thing. I mean, Command and Conquer, Grand Theft Auto, maybe Monkey Island, but there hasn't been a Monkey Island in years
Yeah.
because Disney is deciding not to do anything with it. So there isn't a lot going on
Well, they've got the
that.
key. Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to having the key people to drive it forward. So GTA's, moving forwards because the people at the heart of it are incredibly passionate about what the game is and what needs to be done to get it done, and that's what's kept that moving forwards. Has been that passion of the people behind it. But yeah, something like Monkey Island, there are probably people who do care about it, but they're not necessarily in a position to do anything about it. CNC, for example, the people who really care about that, they probably haven't worked on it for years, and it's gone through all sorts of hands. Yeah, you need to make sure it doesn't necessarily have to be the same people all the way through, but you need people who share that same passion and vision to be able to push that stuff through. And they're not necessarily the people who are doing the day-to-day work. I mean, these are people who can see the bigger picture of what needs to be done and how the day-to-day work will fit into that bigger picture, which is where
project managers, product producers,
well,
those kind of
producers,
people.
yes and no.
No?
More like directors and editors, I think.
Okay.
Producers tend to be more. There's a fine line between this, but they tend to be more product oriented, and they're more interested in quality. Takes a backseat to a certain extent. It's more about these things need to be done within this budget to a certain quality, sure, but they're primarily about. There's a clinicism there that you don't necessarily get with the director who says, a director and editor who's like, well, I don't give a shit how much this costs. I want it to be this good. And you need that degree of friction where you get the sort of creative friction combined with the commercial pragmatism, and that can help enormously.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I remember once interviewing Stefano Arnold, who was the chairman of Tectoy before he resigned, and well, so so he said when they worked on Woody Woodpecker for the Mega Drive and the Master System,
Uh,
he had to tell the development team that well, you have to get it done somehow, or the game will be ready when my childs are born.
but
So
that's what I was talking about earlier with if you look at it from the magazine point of view, that's the attitude you take. We have to get this done. We will get this done. What do we need to do to get this done?
yeah.
And it's not necessarily about killing yourself. Although back in the Zzap days, I think we worked insanely long hours all the time, and that's one way to do it. And you get a lot of this horrible crunch that goes on. Yeah, and sometimes that's just it's not accepting the reality that this needs more time. This cannot be done within this time unless everybody sort of kills themselves to get this thing done.
Yeah. And then was there something in between, or did then happen that you became a Media Legend Award in 2007?
Oh yeah, so that so I left Rockstar beginning of 2000, I think it was. I forget when that was. Yeah, it was beginning of 2000. And it was just similar to the magazines, I guess. I kind of reached a point where I wasn't sure I wanted to do this anymore. I also didn't feel like I needed to be there anymore because the team that was handling GTA 3 at the time, they were incredibly driven and incredibly talented. So they knew exactly how to get. They're basically remaking the first game, but doing a much better job of it.
Okay. Oh.
So I don't know. I guess it's the same sort of deal as before, where professionally and personally, you're thinking, I need something different here.
But that's more an American attitude. I mean, if you look at LinkedIn profiles of American workers, they constantly switch jobs like every 2 to 4 years.
Yeah,
But that's not really an European thing. In Europe, you try to keep your job as long as you can. But you
yeah.
are more like, I need something new to do.
I think part of it is the industry itself, though, where I've been doing this uh, for at least 35 years now, and it's where the industry's changing all the time so
Mm.
much. I mean, I know the world is changing so much because of technology,
Yeah.
but it's been going on I mean, it's a medium that is unique. It's a medium that's new, and how you use that medium of technology and games to tell these stories and to provide entertainment. And this is all new stuff. It's not like anything else at all. It's not like we can borrow from previous media, like plays, films building from plays, for example, and storytelling. Those are established methods they have there that we don't have in games. And we're building our own, but all these things have changed. The technology, the platforms are changing every few years. That's slowing down, which is good. So we've got platforms that have been around for a lot longer than have ever hung around before. And
True.
it personally feels like there's plenty of. Well, Switch is a great example of where that's a much lower tech platform than
Yeah.
PlayStation 4 and Xbox
Yeah.
One, and
Still
yet,
works. Yeah.
yeah, it works extremely brilliantly. I mean, so it's the one platform I think I've used non-stop since it came out,
Yeah.
and that's been for me. That's been at the expense of Xbox One. It's just I can't remember the last time I fired that up
Yeah.
because you just don't need to. There's nothing there that's dragging me back. And PlayStation 4, I still use PlayStation 4 now and then, but nowhere near as much as Switch, which for me
Yeah.
is. And that's an older piece of tech. But this is the great thing. It's improved over the years where people are realizing the tech isn't the be all and end all. You don't have to have super tech to get super games. It's sort of there's a balance that's starting to be achieved there. And and then you get these games coming out on mobile phones, for example, that could have been made 30 odd years ago.
True. True.
Uh, and it goes to show, I think people are much more tolerant as well these days, where
Mm.
they're less fussed about the quality of the technology as long as it does what they want it to do when they want it to do it. So
Yeah.
you get these games still coming out now that are very low tech, and it doesn't matter because the main thing is they are entertaining, they are diverting. You want to play them.
But as I said, the fast evolving also has a little downside, and that is, it appears to me as an outsider that the game industry is a lot higher in fire in some places.
Yeah, I think I don't know if that's unique to the games industry. Um,
The interesting thing is I'm doing this journalistic thing as a hobby,
uh-huh,
and over the last 10 years where I got to know more, high ranked developers
uh-huh,
and CEOs and whatsoever, and people like you, for example, who is an industry veteran, people ask me if I can help them getting a job in the video industry.
uh-huh.
I'm like, well, I'm so much connected now that people ask me if I can help them or if I know somebody getting work. I'm like, wow, you
Yeah,
know.
nice.
So on one side, it's sad. On the other side, it's good to be suddenly a thing, even though I'm not doing it for money.
Yeah.
So
Well, there'll be more people interested in doing it than there were before. It came weird to think that when I started this, it was almost embarrassing that people found it really uncomfortable to talk about video games and computers. It's like you can't. There's no way that's a proper job.
yeah, that's true.
And people just didn't believe in it at all. They thought it was a fad. They thought it was a phase that that it was going through. And a lot of the companies back then, the publishers back then, were people who were businessmen from other businesses, or and they just saw this as a new means of making money. And I'm certainly my memory of back then is that you had two very discrete types of people. You had the men in suits who were old. They probably weren't even that old. They're probably in their late 20s or 30s. And you had this handful of people like myself and Julian who were 18. So we had these young people who were in minority, and these
Yeah,
old, and the developers actually. Sorry, I should have included I meant to include the developers in there. So the young people were the people making the stuff. The old people were the people selling the stuff, and you had a very clear sense of this division. Particularly when you went to shows and so on, or you met with the publishers, they would always be in their suits and would come across. They would feel relatively old, and the developers and yourself were the youngsters. So it's quite a funny division there. Whereas now it's everybody plays games, everybody's into games.
yeah.
It's become really nice. It's become a really sort of mundane thing to do, which is great. It's long overdue, but it's fascinating to have seen it firsthand from the not quite the beginning, but certainly the very early days.
Yes, yes. And um anyway, I don't know if this is exclusive to the game industry, but this hire and fire, as I mentioned before, obviously also depends on your position. I mean, as a PR guy, you are more likely to switch companies
Yeah,
than being a producer or something. Or like in your case, um, you are having actually I don't know, Denki, is that your own company?
no, funnily enough, it was. I was leaving Rockstar in the early 2000, and it was a handful of people who used to work at DMA had decided they wanted to do their own thing, and they believed a lot in. So I had these ideas for development process and development methods that I wanted to try out that weren't really suitable for DMA. Um, and they were really interested in trying those out. So when I'd left and they were setting up Denki or about to set up Denki, they were interested. Are you? Is this something you're interested in doing? Because we believe in what you're talking about, and we want to do these smaller games on um, and turn around games faster, smaller on the lower tech platforms. Is that something that interests you? And it's like what it does. Um, so that's how I got into that. Um,
Ah,
so no, it's I'm not. It's oddly, it's not something that's ever interested me in is owning or running a company. I think I'm more interested in making stuff with people.
interesting. Yeah,
Uh,
interesting is the company name Denki. It sounds German because the company logo is a bulb,
uh,
like you had a thought, like, and in German, denken, thinking.
oh, is
Prob
it? Ha!
Yeah. So
I did not
probably
know that.
this is probably how
It
the
comes from
company's name came
it
from.
come well no, the name Denki comes from Japanese. It's a prefix for electrical things.
Really? Okay,
Yeah,
so it's a coincidence
that's
that
an amazing
it's
coincidence. I did not know this. So yeah, that's where that came from. So Aaron, who I still work with, he
okay.
was I think he was learning Japanese at the time, and
Ah,
I think that's where that came from. And he wanted, I
oh,
know they wanted some sort of a sense of it being a sort of fun little Japanese style developer. So that's
um,
where that came from. So yeah, it's a prefix for electrical things.
nice, nice. Okay, interesting. Yeah, but that was in year 2000, actually.
I think Denki was formed 2000. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So that was before you became a media legend.
Oh yeah, that was 2007. So that was further down the line. That was
Ah,
so by that point, yeah, by that point we had done Game Boy Advance games. I think I'd been working on Crackdown One from
wow.
before that even became a thing because I helped out with. In fact, I did a lot of stuff on Crackdown One, um, which is another big mess.
Which
uh,
is interesting. I figured many of those pioneers that I interview, they often didn't work on the Game Boy. Um, Either they stopped or they moved to other platforms. But now you're saying you did games for the Game Boy Advanced, and
yeah, we did Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, and then we did also lots of set-top box work. So set-top box is probably about as technologically, as far as games are concerned, technologically
yeah,
limiting as you can get because that's just an MPEG player basically. So you're trying to make games that work on an MPEG player, which is a challenge. But that was great fun because that we were churning out stuff. Did almost several hundred, I think, in the end. But we were
wow,
churning stuff out regularly, so we got a chance to put processes to the test. It meant there was a degree of security in when you're making stuff. That worked out extremely well. That proved the process out very effectively. But processes is only as good as the people involved in it. That's also important to remember that process is all very well, but it means nothing without people. Um, so yeah, we did a lot of set top box work for Sky, and that's
wow.
very well. So we were turning it. This I think the fastest we turned out game was 2 weeks. So we're doing it. We do games as episodic. So what we would do is, so some of the initial games would take between 6 and 14 weeks. I think was the longest we did.
Wow.
So they averaged out about 8 to 10 weeks, I think, to spend making these games. And a lot of that was reusing existing technology,
Mm.
building up effectively building up a sort of middleware library. Um, it was the process used and the attitudes that drove that forwards. And the teams we had these little floating teams which worked out really well. So people would have an artist and a coder and a producer, and they'd sort of basically jump around between mix and match with each other depending on how busy their schedule was and so on. And work on these different projects. That was great. It was a mixture of original things, mostly license based stuff in the end because they were the games that sold. But we bring originality to those licensed games, which was cool. And then we did a lot of episodic stuff. So if the game took off, as quite a few of ours did, because we were doing it really well, um, we'd end up doing these really nice episodes, which were more than just reskins. So we'd rebuild the levels, we'd put a new theme in, new story, etc. So it was what I mentioned earlier about more of the same, only different. This is what we're doing with the episodic stuff. So we do those in about 2 weeks. And they were great for if you had new staff. It helped them get used to the process. It gave them a small project to finish, which is the important thing I mentioned before, finishing. And it's great. You'd end up with, hey, we finished the game in 2 weeks, and it's
Ah,
it's a new game. So if you're a fan of the game, you're really happy because you got new stuff. Yeah, brilliant little process. So we did that for quite a while. But parallel to that, once I got that um, um, side of it working, um, it needed me less. I moved over to help out with the early design of, well, it was called Car Wars before it was called Crackdown.
ah,
Um, and that was a very different type of game. That mutated quite a lot, and goes to show where you really need to have a strong um, direction, someone who really understands what it is you're making, but you also need to be able to prove what it is you're making as soon as possible, which again goes back to finishing things. So if you're making something that's unique, then it's trapped in someone's head. It doesn't really help anybody. And trying to take that out of someone's head and make that a reality is incredibly difficult. And then of course you're building another game like GTA, which is the sort of open world thing, but
Wow.
you're trying to build a different type of game, so you're trying to build it differently with um, a different approach. That makes it hard. But yeah, we put together a nice package and sold that to Microsoft, who funded the development of that. That was challenging. I did a lot of design and writing on that at the end. Um, yeah,
Heavy.
that only got salvaged because that wasn't going very well because again it was not an easy thing to make. There was a company which most of which ended up being Ruffian um, in Dundee. It was the core of that company came in towards the end and or towards the middle end. It was towards the later part of the project. Without them, that would have never got finished because they were like a crack team of code and project commandos, code mandos. They
Okay.
dropped in and helped out and got that done because as I say, without them, that would have never come out. And then after that, I think I worked on an educational thing was that PC? Was that Java? Might have been Java based thing. We did some other set-top box games for a company called DirecTV in America. That was with DHTML, which is the most technologically crude technology ever. But we've managed to get some nice little games working on that just by believing, right, this can be done. How can we do this? Uh,
Nice.
and we did quite a few games with them. We did some other companies as well, other set-top boxes, Cablevision and some others. What else did we do? We did loads of mobile phone games when mobile phones were
Oh
black
yeah.
black and white, tiny,
Yeah.
cranky little things with buttons. Um,
Right.
that was hard. So we did a few games with that.
Yeah.
We did some.
I just interviewed on Sunday Stello de Souza, who was a
Uh-huh.
game designer in the 80s and then worked on Commodore 64 stuff and Amiga, and he told me working on the Game Boy Color, the music documentation of the hardware
Yeah.
was so bad, and what Nintendo supplied was so bad, he actually used trackers on Amiga
Yes. I
and
can
wrote
believe that.
his own converter because that was the only way to get out music that didn't sound like Tetris or Super Mario Land.
Yeah, I can believe it.
I
Yeah,
was like, oh my god.
they're definitely an interesting company to deal with. They have their very particular way of. There's loads of stuff I learned from. I didn't ever work directly with them when I was at DMA, but there were a few people there I was friendly with who did work with more directly with Nintendo, and a lot of the Nintendo processes are incredibly interesting, and I've certainly borrowed from a few of their processes. I really liked a couple of the ways they did things. Um, they have a brilliant process with post-it notes where I'm assuming they still use this as well, where you effectively one of the processes you have a room that's pretty much just full of post-it notes, and the post-it notes all sort of link together, and it's sort of like an idea chaining process. So people can write down ideas or parts of a design problem, for example, and they can string them together by sticking together the post-it notes. And it's a really interesting method of breaking down it sort of overlapped and helped me expand on a lot of my ideas of process. So yeah, I think I've borrowed a few things from them. They had a really
Wow.
nice idea with because they were doing Body Harvest at the time, and they provided some input into that. But their input was always they kind of want the team to get on with it. They don't want to don't want to direct it too hard. They just want to provide some feedback. But they had an interesting idea where the game initially was more of a sort of 3D defender, so it was strictly action based. But one of their thoughts was you needed some sort of contrast. You need this dramatic contrast. They didn't frame it like this. This is what I've learned from it. So they were sort of nudging. Why don't you try some indoor stuff as well? So you've got indoor stuff and outdoor stuff. And you realize there's a lot of how a lot of older Nintendo games are really carefully structured like that, where they're very good at contrasting perceptual contrast, where you go from one space into another space. So the idea being that the outdoor playing outdoors all the time gets really boring because the repetition becomes more pronounced. So you punctuate that by having some indoor sequences. And it's a really nice piece of obvious yet not that obvious design balance that they apply.
Yeah, it sounds a bit like Katakis. No, not Terrican.
Uh-huh.
Terrican when they decided to make some space levels. And like,
Yeah,
wow, this is like totally a total different game. But it was spicing it up and making it
it
not so
means
boring anymore.
it means you get more out of what you've got as well. So
Exactly.
if it's all very samey, you can actually make it feel less samey just by punctuating it with some other stuff. And these are sort of basic techniques that are understood in other media forever. So when you're writing songs, you don't just have chorus, 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 chorus. You have some verses in there to break it up.
Yeah.
And you have other bits of structure that get thrown in there to make the repetition less obvious.
But I learned, I think it was 3 years ago, um, that some publishers are trying to copy a concept or putting a concept on a game. I remember when I was interviewed for when I was invited for an interview for an action RPG, and I was looking at it and I was like, okay, they put an intro in front that has a storyline, but in nature it's a beat 'em up game. You have some really bad uh, design choices at some places.
Yeah.
Just taking a game that isn't really an RPG, putting a story in it, and then calling it an action RPG, despite it's just a beat 'em up game, because now that is what people want. And
Yeah,
like,
that's pretty much like sausages and ice cream, where sausages are nice on their own and ice cream's nice on its own, but you don't necessarily want to put the two together.
In the end, the interview didn't happen because other media was faster in getting slots and was like, okay, it's not too hard. I wasn't interested in the first place anyway. I mean, how I'm supposed to do the interview? Like, what are you selling? What are you selling is actually not what you are offering. That
Yeah,
doesn't really fit, you know.
yeah,
uh, I mean, I would rather play a round of Street Fighter 2 than playing a game that pretends to be something it isn't.
yeah,
Uh, ah, really, really hard sometimes. Really
yeah.
hard
Oh,
sometimes.
definitely, and I think that's true of all media. That where that happens, where it's perceived as one thing, but it ends up being clearly something else entirely.
Uh-huh. So, yeah, you mentioned the word media. So, how did it happen you became a games media legend in
That
2007?
that was who did that? I can't remember who did that. I think it was a leading magazine publisher at the time. So they decided they were going to do. I think they were already doing loads of other types of awards, but they decided there needed to be more. There weren't really any um, games media awards, and you got games media in the world, but in the UK in particular, it's quite a powerful thing. And yet, it's not getting the recognition it deserves, and the people behind it not really getting the recognition they deserve. So they started this series of awards. I don't know how long they've been going before that, but they started this new award, um, which was the media legend. So they wanted to acknowledge people who had made a significant contribution to games media. And so I've obviously done a few things over the years. So apparently I was the first one ever and decided it's got to be him. So
Wow. Yeah, I just read it was given by the Guardian Games blog.
I can't remember. Probably.
Yeah. But it's interesting. When I spoke to other people like Chris Hülsbeck, when he won his award, his answer was like, I'm not too old yet. I still want to make 30 years.
Funny enough, I said something similar as well. Yeah, it felt to me like an award that you give to somebody who's dead. It's one of those posthumous awards. But
Uh,
yeah, that was I was really quite touched by that.
hmm.
I think I just had Yeah, I think our son, our third child, had only been born like a few weeks before that, so I had to make a decision as to whether to go down.
Wow. So, I mean, how is it for you as being a veteran nowadays? Did you know back in the day that what you were working on was breaking, like GTA or some of the other games, or didn't you know what you got into when you got into it?
Oh, and yeah, and none of the. I mean, I've in all sorts of ways been involved in things that have been quite influential. So you don't think about it at the time at all. In fact, you don't really think about it afterwards either. They're things you do. There are things you want to do. You tend to be enjoying doing it more than you are. You're not really thinking about its implications or its value beyond it's something that you feel needs to be done.
Mm,
So you're just consumed by doing it. Um, so no, I've never even realised. Even when you're making,
mhm.
even with something as recent as GTA, yeah, that's a thing that needs to be done. That's all it is really, and you find it quite exciting, so you want to do it. I mean, I've worked on things I've not enjoyed, and you want to get those out of the way as soon as possible.
And here's another thing. Many people outside of the video game industry thinks that once you are a veteran, your name gives you all the money and publishers you need. And we once did an interview with Ron Gilbert.
Uh-huh.
Everybody knows Ron Gilbert.
Yep.
And though we were like, okay, so you can go to any publisher and say like, give me the money, I'm Ron Gilbert, fools. And his answer was like, actually that's not the case.
No, it's not. That's very true. And, I mean, to a certain extent, who you know helps enormously.
Okay.
Um, but when there's money involved, there needs to be a certain degree of justification, and otherwise you're not going to get that cash. So there has to be a degree of conviction, belief that this can be done regardless of who you are.
Mm.
Um, no, it's certainly true. I mean, I've never been anything approaching rich, and it's just sort of not really my thing.
Mm.
And I've not noticed it opening doors, or I've never really tried to use it, so I don't know.
Okay, so it's not like you are running around. I'm a video game industry veteran.
uh,
It's not like you're running around.
oh hell no, no. I live in a small, modest house in a fishing village. I drive an old um, Hyundai i10. Yeah, I'm afraid I'm as humble as they get.
Okay. Yeah, but
Um,
but but having your own Wikipedia entry and being in mentioned in certain media and databases and so on must be something you are proud of because you achieved something and it will be
oh,
there for the
I,
time being.
I see what you mean. Yeah, I'm not ashamed of anything. Um, I guess I'm not a kind of proud person, so
Okay.
I certainly think it's a nice thing. It's definitely not a bad
Okay.
thing at all.
Uh,
And I think it's really. I always used to find it weird in the Zzap days in particular because it was so pronounced when you would go to shows and people would know who you were, and I found all that it's sort of simultaneously flattering and I wouldn't say uncomfortable. It's just a bit odd. And you get it from time to time. It's not happened for years now, but you get it from time to time where you'll be in a shop or a supermarket and someone would recognize you and mention that they recognize you, and that would be odd. I'm not sure how people deal with it on a if they're proper famous. That that's that
Uh,
must be really strange.
but
So,
but but I have to admit it helped when I got the invitation from the PR company to make an interview with you in the presentation about Autonauts.
mm,
When I read the name Gary Penn, I was like, okay, I'm not interested in this kind of game particularly, but
uh-huh.
it's Gary Penn. It's Gary Penn. You
Well,
know,
thank you. That's very kind.
so they actually use it as a marketing gig for inviting journalists, and it
Yeah,
worked. It
there'll
worked.
be a certain I guess there'll be a certain age or type of person who will remember who I am. There's a massive because I'm not. There'll be a massive chunk of people who don't. So I know that when I go to industry events, and this has been like this for years, where it's gone from knowing everybody to hardly knowing anyone, and that's strange um, going to places, going to shows, going to events, and realizing I don't know anyone here.
Yeah.
And that's weird because I've not done it as often. There'll be at the beginning of my career, it would be something you would do regularly. You would see people regularly, and certainly the industry back then was a lot smaller and cozier. It felt almost like a village, and everybody knew everybody. Of course, as it expands, and you're not sort of out there as much as you were. Yeah, you're not seeing as many people. You're not meeting up with the newer people who are coming into the business. So that sort of tapers off, and it's a very peculiar feeling when you realize how it used to be and how it is now. And everybody looks so young now as well. Now that I'm old.
Yeah, like I said, this is why I had that is why I had the feeling that you were especially happy to meet somebody that looks young but still knows all the history from back then, you know.
I
And
think,
I was very pleased to see when I was at the appointment that on Michael Fisher's, I think his name is Michael Fisher, right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. On his smartphone, he actually had our homepage open. Like, oh my God, they did their research. Because
cool,
when I go to interviews, sometimes they have no idea who we are, what we
yeah,
do.
yeah,
Like, oh gosh, so why I'm even invited if you don't know why you invited me?
yeah. No, I know. That's one of the things I used to take. Actually, I still take pride in that when I'm making games based on other people's properties. So I used to hate it when people just didn't know, hadn't it just made any effort at all to understand or research. Um, Whereas, so if I'm doing a game, for example, I'll make sure I understand. I really get into the brand, and I
Mhm.
really get if you go to forums, you can find out what people really think about the brand and which bits they really like about the brand, and suddenly it's not a brand anymore. You suddenly something you really like. So one of my most extreme examples I'd say was I did a Barbie game once. I have negative interest in Barbie, but
Oh,
for that duration of the game, you give a shit and you care about it, and I think that's important if you're doing that, rather than it being if you. I think it can come across as well. You can almost feel the disinterest or the negativity if you're not careful um, in something that you've made if you don't care.
wow. I mean, if you look down in history, it was actually Mattel and one of those high-ranked people uh, responsible for the Barbie brand that actually said like, "Hey, I want this Power Glove to be released on the NES,"
Yeah,
which was a failure. But giving this female marketing person a Power Glove alpha version and knock out somebody in knockout. That
yeah.
was an experience like, hey, I'm usually responsible for Barbies, but I want this product to be made. So, uh, sometimes strings pull together anyway.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. As I mentioned earlier, that's certainly one of those things I've seen with something like GTA, where when three came together, that was amazing how that came together with all these different threads. I thought of it in terms of planets aligning almost, where this solar system of planets are suddenly this perfect line. Yeah, that's amazing how that can happen, and it's one of these things where you can't predict it. I don't see how you can manipulate it. It just happens.
So how did you end up working on this? You said Barbie game, despite you're not interested in Barbie. Is
Yeah,
how
that was
how do you
for.
deal with that inner conflict?
I think part of it helps that the game you're making isn't you're not going to be making it forever. So this was a small game we were making for DirecTV. So I think it was only 6 to 8 weeks of work. Um, you just kind of get on with it. You, it's one of these things where I think if you're not going to enjoy it, it's going to be a miserable time. Um, I'd say my principal concern is, if I'm on the other end of this and Barbie was mine, I'd be really pissed off to learn that I didn't care.
Ah,
Um,
true. true.
Yeah, and in fairness, there are all these interesting things you can learn about the way because I like learning, um, and I think if you sort of shut that out, you're going to miss out on quite a lot of things. So looking at something you don't actually like but trying to find the good in it, it's quite a it's a personally enriching thing to a certain extent, I think.
I mean, it's the same, as I said, when talking to Stello. His most known music contribution on the Game Boy Color is his Happy Hippo game he did the music for, and it was like,
Cool.
hey, did you think that back in the day a Kinder Surprise brand game would be your most recognizable work?
Amazing.
So yeah, so hey, and even if you go to Reddit, it still says like every piece of this soundtrack sounds perfect.
Cool.
So you never know, maybe your body game is someday becoming famous. I don't know.
Well,
So
I do also like to think that someone on the other end of it who likes Barbie is going to play it and think, "Oh, I like this," and as part of the reason you're making stuff in the first place is
yeah,
to share it with
true,
others. And when you find out they liked it, it's even better. I
true,
think it's one of these things where if you even find out one person liked it, that for me is usually that's a
true.
good enough reason for doing it in the first place.
Now, are you one of those persons who's actually looking up on the internet or in the magazines how well the games made when you were involved in it, like Metacritics or something?
Oh no, I don't bother with
You
that.
don't want to know what the end result was, what the critics think?
You usually find out because someone will tell you,
Ah,
and
okay.
particularly if you're dealing with
Yeah.
your publisher, will eventually it will
Ah,
unavoidably come across your eyes. So you sort of find out these things. No, it doesn't really
mm,
interest me that much. I mean, if you're going to learn anything from that,
mm.
I don't think the process has changed massively since I used to do the reviewing side of things. So also know what it's like on the other side of things. And it can be as simple as I'm just not interested in this kind of thing, or you don't get enough time to play it.
Mm,
There are all these reasons why someone
true,
may or may not like what you've done,
true.
and particularly when it's a bit different to something else. So, I mean, I don't think for me there's any benefit to knowing whether anyone liked it or disliked it, um, unless you're dealing directly with players. Discord I like because you're dealing directly with players, and they're usually quite open about what they do and don't like and why they do or don't like something, and that has been more useful for us shaping how the
Yeah.
game works than anything else.
Constructive feedback is sometimes difficult to get
Oh,
nowadays.
very much so. And I don't I don't know if you're familiar with the six thinking hats, Edward de Bono method of sort of
No, no.
he proposed this idea for six thinking hats, and it was used to help um, make discussions, among other things, arguments less argumenty. It was to help people be clear about what they were thinking about, but also to use it as a tool for shaping the thinking. So he has like a red hat, which is an emotional thing, and the black hat, which is all about negativity, and then there's
Ah,
yellow hats about positivity. The green hat is about new ideas, and there's the blue hat and the white hat, which are about facts. The white hat's about facts, and the blue hat is about structure. But what's nice about that is it means you start to appreciate. Well, you know what? People will have these emotional reactions to things, and having an emotional reaction to something, whether it's positive or negative, is much more interesting than being indifferent, because indifference is just horrible.
ah,
Um, so people are you can't stop the way people feel about things. It's how they choose to use that feeling, how they articulate that feeling, and then how you deal with how they articulate that feeling. So people are entitled to say, I just feels bad to me, or this I really like the way this feels. Um, and people will have these opinions. You'll get other people who are a little more white hat. They'll try and figure out factual reasons why these things are the way they are. Why do I feel like this? I think I feel like this because of this. Certainly, when you're making games, actually, if you're dealing with publishers, I find their feedback I prefer their feedback to be more Red Hat, to be more feeling based, and it can generally throw up sort of false cues and misinformation if they try to overanalyze why it is something isn't working. So I'd sooner have somebody come back saying, this just doesn't feel, or this feels this to me. This makes me sad playing this bit of the game, or this bit feels too hard, rather than I think this bit's too hard because um, they may or may not be right. Um,
Mm.
but the point is, it can throw things off a bit because their emotional reaction is the bit that you should be using as a sort of guiding light there. Then you can try and figure out, I wonder why it is they're feeling that then. And it might be something completely unrelated to the bit that they think it is. Um, so that's where the player feedback as well can be handier if it's more emotional, and then you can start asking people why. So whereabouts were you when you were doing this? What were you doing when you were doing this? And what led up to this? And it's never easy to figure out why these things work, particularly when the game's as complicated as something like Autonauts, which can get quite complicated. Um, but it's I find it a much more useful tool than I do someone trying to figure out why they don't like something.
I like it that you really see it rational. I mean, there are examples in the video game industry. For example, Peter Molyneux.
Mhm.
He is told to be not talking to the press anymore because they
Yes.
were too negative.
Yeah.
And like, oh well, you are working in the business.
Well, Peter tends to get carried away, and Dave Jones is a similar sort of character. They get carried away with their ideas, and they're happy to share. Whereas some people are more guarded, maybe about their ideas, and less willing to share them because they think they might be stolen. People like Peter and Dave Jones, they will just go blah blah. I'm just going to tell you everything I'm thinking about right now off the top of my head.
Okay.
Which I think is a double-edged sword. Sometimes I think if they're not careful, like Peter ends up digging himself into holes because he says these things that people take, like, they'll take it as verbatim that that's going to be the case. And what it was he kind of had this idea at the time and was quite happy to share that idea, but it comes across as it being because there's a degree of conviction in what he's saying. He completely believes in what he's saying. He believes this will happen and he believes this will become a thing. But of course, the reality is often quite different. So I can see how it happens where he gets he kind of puts his foot in it too often because he says too much, basically.
Yeah, I see the game industry is a different field to walk on. Different characters, different directions publishers go. As I said, some trying to copy or marketing their games as a genre it isn't.
Yeah.
Oh my god, yeah.
So sometimes that's down to they misunderstand it. They don't really care enough about it because it's quite hard to find. You've got publishers who tend to be more commercially motivated than anything else, and of course the creators who tend to be more creatively motivated than anything else. And trying to find that sort of happy medium is very difficult.
Okay. So, should we close with your perspective? What are your next plans, and where do you want to be in the next, let's say, 5 years?
God, I don't know. I've
You don't
I've
have
realized
plans. You live for the moment.
to a certain extent I do try that, yes. But you can't pragmatically live your life like that in the modern world, unfortunately. Um, there are, yeah, we've got plans for Autonauts because we're still enjoying making that. So the main thing we're focusing on with Autonauts is trying to figure out, what more should we do with it? Because it feels like there's so many things we can do with it. So we sat down once we got the last update out. We sat down and thought about what sort of types of games might we play with the toys that are Autonauts. Um, and we sat down, we came up with like dozens of these different things. We sat down and came up with obvious types of games that you could do, like RTSs, adventure games, etc. And how would they work using what we've got and the ideas that we've got? And loads of ideas came out of that. And we picked the one that we felt was most. We're starting with survival mode, which is the complete opposite to what we've got. And the reason we went for that was because it is the complete opposite to what we've got. We figure that as we're going through trying to figure out all these different ways to play, you realize there are all these different things this might draw out from the existing game. So even from doing survival mode, we've discovered that there are a lot of new things that we can add to the main game that will improve the main game,
Mm.
the overall game. So there are benefits to doing this, and certainly the benefit of doing a more extreme um, uh, opposite take on what we're doing. So we've gone from this nice game with no violence and no money and none of the staples that you normally have, which is a very conscious decision. We thought we'd try something with some weapons and some fighting and some cash. And then we've got the survival mode, which is not like the normal game at all. It's going to be a separate mode, completely separate mode, so you don't have to play it. But it's teaching us a lot about what we can do with the Autonaut toys and how you play with them. So that's the main mode we're working on at the moment, survival mode, which is about space pirates, and you end up having to program your units to fight, and you need to set up little programmed little medic bots and ammunition and so on and so on. So it's like a mixture between a tower defense game and an RTS, and it's got a bit of farming in it as well as the sort of main means of earning some cash to buy things.
No, so this survival mode sounds a bit to me like Don't Starve Together.
It could. That's probably one. Yeah, I've definitely been inspired by lots of different types of things. So having played that, yeah, there's bits of that, definitely bits of that in there. I can't think what it reminded. There are a few games it reminded me of when after we came out of the initial thinking. But funny enough, Don't Starve wasn't one of them. But there are lots of similar sorts of games like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that is one of the things I noticed at Gamescom when you talk to a developer from let's say 20 something age, and he's working on an IP that has a 25 years old history, and I'm going back as a retro lover asking like what is in for people between the age of 35 and 45 who are
Yeah.
elderly gamers, which is now the average gaming age group, and they're like, I don't know, because they are so new into the business, and they really didn't dig deep backwards in time to really being able to answer the question. So I'm always the alien in the press conference, but because I'm always asking the questions nobody prepared for.
Yeah. Well, there's also the other thing I'm always conscious of is there is so much more to do these days than there's ever been before, and
Yeah,
there are so many more games to play, and there are so much more music and so much more TV.
yeah.
There are so many things you could do instead of any one other thing,
Mm.
including games. So, I mean, I feel massively left behind by all sorts of stuff because I just don't have time. I don't make the time to play all these things, or to
But
watch all
but
these things.
but in this interview, you never said, I don't know, I never heard of this. You
Uh,
always had an answer, so you're still keeping up with things.
Yeah, I do try, but yeah, it gets harder and harder. And also, the thing I find most disconcerting is when people are talking about some aspects of a game that I have played, but they're talking about aspects of the game that I have not got to and probably never will get to. Actually, Zelda Wind Waker is one of those games where I got I got going on that. I had great fun with that, but my kids have been playing that for hundreds of hours, and they're telling me about stuff later on. I'm like, I didn't get that far. I have no idea what you're on about. And that sounds cool, but I know the level of investment I'll have to make to get to that point. I'll never do it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I once did an interview with father and daughter, Hui Games, who were former Yusen, um, and
Oh yeah.
his father said like, son, whatever you do, don't become a game designer, don't become a game publisher when you're an adult. And that is exactly what he did. I'm
Yeah.
like, Rob, no, don't do it, but he did it.
Yeah.
And then like, okay, it's keeping being a family business, even if the original
Yeah.
founder says like, you should rather go somewhere else than in this
That's definitely
unstable,
something.
rushed game industry.
Well, yes, but that's definitely something that occurs in other businesses as well. The family business gets handed down, whether it's a blacksmith's or a baker's, and these days, of course, games developer slash publisher is thrown into that mix.
Yeah. But but
Cool.
but basically, you wouldn't mind if your kids go the same road you did.
Oh, not at all. Like, the main thing for me is that they remain happy. So I think my eldest is just off to uni for she's studying microbiology. So she may end up bringing microbiology back into games. I don't know, but she's
Wow.
definitely going down a very different path.
Okay. Okay.
Uh, so we'll see
Yeah.
what happens. But it's I think it's also the making things is a good thing, a good pursuit for people to do, and making things with people. I think that's the thing I've taken most out of the common thing that appeals to me most throughout the 30 odd years is you making things with people for people,
Yeah.
and providing you get that loop. That's one of the things I loved about magazines, and it's better and worse for different reasons now. Was the feedback you get from the slow paced letters pages where people send the letter in. It would take forever to get printed and sorted. And of course, now it's so instantaneous. Um, but that feedback loop is incredibly important,
Mm.
and it can sometimes get a bit nasty these days, which is a
Yeah.
shame. And it's
Well, I mean, I don't remember his name, but the coder who did E.T., which was proclaimed to be the worst video game ever made in history
yeah,
for
yeah.
the VCS, he actually quit the business and became a how you say it? A psychotologist?
Oh, really?
Or what's the name in English?
A sociologist?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And like, wow, if you take feedbacks that hard that you actually quit the business and doing something else,
Yeah.
that's really harsh, you know?
Well, I can understand how that happens though, because if you're all it takes is if you're not in a particularly great mood that day, and somebody starts laying into you for something that you, I mean that it also depends how much of it is out of your control as well.
Mm,
If it's just a job and something you needed to get done and it had to be done, and you had, your choices were limited. It was either do it or not, but it needed to be done. And then suddenly someone's pulling you apart for it. It's like, hey, it's not my fault. I didn't do this to piss you off. But people
yeah,
also don't tend to. There's a lot more. It's harder to. We're not really trained to deal with that degree of feedback because people
mm,
don't do it in reality as often. I mean, funny thing is, we did used to get a lot of personal feedback when we did the shows back in the Zzap days. It was usually positive, but sometimes you get people calling all sorts of names. Um, but that's not a normal thing to do. Most of the time, when people are throwing out insults towards people on Twitter, it's so depersonalized, and they don't tend to realize there is a person on the other end of this, and they probably really are feeling it.
I understand, yeah. So, as I said, you are much more over this and not taking it to your heart.
Oh God, yeah. Well, yes and no. I mean,
Yes and no.
you get these bursts where someone will say something, and again, depending on what sort of mood you're in, you may have had a late night, you may not have slept particularly well, whatever. Um, you may get this initial reaction, but I think it's one of these things you get better at dealing with,
Mm,
as opposed to it being something you never experience. Whereas when I was certainly younger, that time, that difference between me having a reaction and me reacting was usually quite small, and I would be less tolerant,
okay, okay.
a lot
Yeah,
less tolerant. Um,
yeah.
I've certainly got more tolerant over the years.
Great. Well, that would be all from my side. I thank you very much for your insight in your long history of,
Well, yes,
well,
there's
over
probably
30
lots.
years, right?
Yes, I've certainly missed a lot out there, and I'm really sorry I can't remember any Zap stuff. Um, I've been asked this before, and it's
Good. It's all
depending on the trigger. Sometimes I do remember things, but usually I don't. And it's a great
I
shame
didn't
because it was a really interesting time, and there are certainly tales to be told.
well, I didn't invite you to talk about Zzap 64 exclusively. So
No,
it's
it's
all good.
just
It's all good. Yeah,
cool,
cool. Great.
fantastic. You
Yeah,
take
yeah.
care.
Thank you. You
Hopefully,
too.
see you soon.
Bye-bye. Yeah, see
Bye.
ya.